IBM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, welcome to today's podcast. And I'm Sridhar Krishna, your host for today. And I've got with me my colleagues from Takshashila Institution, Satya Sahu and Bharath Reddy. The three of us have been working on, as part of our high-tech and geopolitics group, we've been working on this this subject of AI governance. And as part of that, of AI governance, I thought it's important for us. Today, our focus is going to be around data, right? So, let me just kick this off, Satya and Bharat. See, artificial intelligence has been around for a long time. While there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence in the market today, and everybody has heard of ChatGPT and so on. AI is not new. A.M.Turing wrote a paper in 1950 called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And then where he discussed how to build such machines and how to test their intelligence. The Turing test is still considered as something which is important for understanding whether something is AI or not, right? So similar, but even way back in 1956, there was a prototype that was developed in AI. And there was John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. So at the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. So they did that. But after that, I think despite having made some promises in AI at that point, it sort of went into a decline. And then there was what is known as AI winter. And now in the last couple of decades, there's been tremendous work which has happened and phenomenal progress, which has now led to what everybody is doing. So Satya, what are your thoughts? Do you think this is another hype like the hype that we had in the 50s and 60s, or is it different? What do you think about?
It's definitely not a hype machine anymore. It's the investment and the output coming from the AI research sector has actually moved a lot of other sectors forward, tangibly and visibly. So it's definitely not that. NVIDIA just crossed the $1 trillion market value. I think there are three main reasons for why the AI boom happened in the last few years. Is A, the digitization of records and data that we usually wouldn't have digitized before, let's say the early 2000s, began to scale up drastically as governments began to use cloud-based or technology-based solutions to, let's say, impart social welfare, for instance, like Aadhaar, UID, AI, all of that. That kind of scale of digitization happened at a very fast pace from the mid-2000s, I want to say. It could be wrong there. So you have so many publicly available data sets, even private data sets for that matter. At the same time, private corporations like Facebook, for instance, saw that they had a plethora, unimaginable level of user-generated data and content that, now after data protection laws are in place, the ownership is unclear to some extent. But at the time, it was completely on Facebook's hands, for instance. Mm-hmm. All of that is not been monetized so far, had not been monetized so far at that time. And so obviously the pathway, the avenue towards monetizing it needed immense computational power, and the human cognitive capacity is not built for that, right? So the obvious answer to that is to create or automate some sort of machine learning. That's probably it. The last part, I think, is the collaborative nature of AI research or machine learning work began to take off, I think, again, after the internet provided a platform for researchers to come around the world. Again, I want to say after the early 2000s, it really took off, which is why from, I think, the late 2010s, early 2010s, you can see the amount of collaboration and the amount of output online has increased drastically. So all these three factors, and then regardless of that, the semiconductor industry, the computational hardware part of it, where NVIDIA, for instance, when they introduced the Pascal architecture, they decided to go all in on that regard. So you have demand the incentives for the market to develop AI and machine learning, as well as the resources to make it happen. And then you have data being generated from both private and governmental sources. So
Absolutely. I think, thank you very much, Satya, because essentially, if you look at the difference between 50s and 60s and now, the fact that computing is available. Computing is cheap. You can store data. At those days, you couldn't store any information. A computer did not have any storage, right? It could. That's how it was in the early computers were like that. So I think like the whole change, the shift of like the making storage so ubiquitous, compute easily available and cheap, and the cloud and the availability of the internet and the ability to collaborate, like you mentioned, I think have made AI a reality today compared to just a nice little idea and science fiction from in those days. 1960. When was this movie 2001: A Space Odyssey made? I think like maybe in the 60s or 70s or something like that, right? Like
I
very, very long ago. Yeah. So, but anyway, I think like these were kind of things. At that time, AI was just something in science fiction, but today it's real. And I think coming back to it, Bharat, do you want to tell us how these AI models are developed? Should we be worried? Do you think like all my Facebook data has been used to sort of create these large language models?
So just adding on to what Satya was saying, right? So it's a lot of data, it's a lot of compute, all of these coming together, which enables these large language models. So there's a difference between the machine learning that you were seeing in the past decade, 2 decades, and these large language models in terms of what they're capable of, right? So you can have conversations with them, you can prompt them for something, and they're able to generate an image from that prompt. So it's a very versatile tool that can serve a large number of use cases. And so this is possible because they've trained it on a large amount of data, and once it's at these certain threshold, they've seen that these kind of develop these kind of properties where they're able to predict what text there should come after a certain kind of a response, and tasks like this are now possible. Now for doing these things, first of all, you need a large amount of data, and what you see is that the larger the data, the better the performance of these models, and the better the quality of the data, the better the performance that you see. Now, like Sridhar, now to answer your question, I don't think Facebook or Google are specifically using user data to train the models, the AI large language models. They're using more the publicly available source of data, like say Wikipedia or scientific journals or books, for example. And but there is still a concern that these companies have a large amount of data of users available with them, and if they use that to train these models, they will have unsurpassable advantage over their rivals. To just take one example in this context, a couple of months back, Zoom updated their terms and conditions to allow them to use user data, the audio and video calls that people have, to train their AI models. Now, with those kind of models, you can probably have it'll allow them to generate, say, meeting notes, summaries of the meetings, probably predict who's going to speak next, and maybe highlight them onto the screen, things like this, right? So, and it'll probably find innovative ways of reducing Zoom fatigue, things like that. So, when someone has that kind of data and they're able to do these kind of things, it's very difficult for their competitors to match the features that they're offering. And even for users, it'll be very difficult to move to a different platform because there'll be nothing really comparable to what this platform offers. So this is something that you need to think about seriously so that you can see how this industry is shaping up and how it needs to be governed.
Yeah, and this entire tech industry and social media and many of the entire platform economy, if you look at it, it's been having this network effect where you have one or two, a few very small number of people who are dominating, and they just have all the power in the network. They are the ones who everybody goes to, and then that kind of power gets concentrated. Now with AI, and when such power gets concentrated, everybody's worried about harm is one aspect of it, but there's another aspect. You want to make sure that all types of companies are able to come out and develop. Otherwise, innovation will be throttled. If if only a few people who have access to this kind of data build walls around that data, and then they have that data for themselves, and it's not available to anybody else. And I think that's something that we are trying to look at, especially, right? So when we look at data and the problems with data, you also want to make sure that there's enough innovation which happens, and your data is not just available with a few, but it's available to a larger group while you take care of privacy, etc.? How do you ensure that there's enough competition in the market? So, Satya, you were talking about who owns this data. So now, if Zoom or Facebook and all these people, they decide that now they've got access to all this information, they can build interesting models on top of it. They can use this data, use this knowledge of our behavior to take over and have great power. Now, who owns this data? I mean, do I own my data, or does Facebook own it?
The answer to this is very unclear because there are two things. A, when we are looking at AI regulation and government stances on it, it is markedly different from what a lot of researchers or technical experts might want to collaboratively say should be a principle-based approach. I'll use the case studies of the EU and India, for instance. Generally, the EU legal instruments that are relevant for data access and ownership are the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which defines the rights of data subjects like us, the ones who are generating the data or giving up our personal data. And the other thing is a database directive that grants ownership rights to database producers. Now, even if these two things exist, there's a fairly gray area where data access is primarily ruled and regulated by bilateral or multilateral contracts and other measures that give exclusive control or non-exclusive control to the de facto data holders or market entities that drive the access, the trading and pricing of this data. Right. So ownership rights can also be thought about in terms of public data sets, private data sets, user-generated data, or synthetic data. Right. So, and all of these generally are governed by the terms and conditions or contracts. Right now, depending on the type and origin of the data, this ownership and rights vary. Now, in the US, there is no comprehensive federal law, right? So, which regulates data ownership. So, there are some sector-specific laws, health data, financial or educational data, right? The HIPAA, I think the insurance.
Yeah, HIPAA, health insurance.
It gives patients the right to access and control their health records, for instance. Then there is I think students and their families have the right to access and their educational records. There's the federal act that does that. But again, in general, it's determined by contractual agreements there. And there are multiple parties involved. There are data providers, data consumers, data brokers, for instance. This is also where we haven't even factored intellectual property rights coming into the picture, because when some databases or data sets may involve originality or creativity, they may be afforded IPR protection accordingly. For instance, let's say Snapchat decides to look at data and then create a database on some weird parameter that has some sort of industrial use or commercial use. That can be given protection, right? So like I mentioned in the EU as well, the GDPR is very stringent. It imposes a lot of obligations on the data controllers, processors to ensure there's a whole bunch of lawfulness, fairness, transparency, accountability for the data practices. But as long as these are complied with, again, the contractual nature of data ownership is still there. In India, again, it's pretty much the same picture. But the Personal Data Protection Bill that has been quote unquote inspired by the GDPR and has a principle-based approach is pretty much the same, except there is a lot of leeway for the government to exempt private entities from any additional imposition for this. So in this aspect, it's very worrying. But so like Bharath mentioned, a lot of the large language models like AMA, for instance, they're not trained on, I think, user-generated data, or at least the companies say that they're on. But Facebook, for instance, has had a history of using billions of Instagram images to train its AI algorithms. This has been reported since back in 2018. So the concern about, even if we say that, okay, the copyright belongs with the user uploaded the image, does not mean that the rights related to processing of the data is vested with them. The terms and conditions determine that Facebook has that right to.
So basically, I think we talked about that AI is not new. We talked about the fact that there's greater need for AI governance today. We talked about how data is used to train these foundational models, AI models, etc. But we also briefly went into who owns this data and these guys are developing it. What are the issues? And I think maybe after a short break, we can come back and have this conversation around what are the legal implications of this? What are the kind of access rules that one can have in the future? How does one overcome these walled gardens that get created by these individual players and so on? Welcome back. And Bharat, you wanted to talk about GitHub before we tackle some of these other topics. Go ahead.
So on the topic about of who owns this data and when something has been created by these AI models, where does this ownership lie? So one example which kind of makes this very clear is this feature called GitHub Copilot, which was introduced by GitHub in collaboration with OpenAI. So this is basically an AI powered tool which is designed to assist developers by suggesting lines or blocks of code when they're coding. So based on what you're coding, it'll generate piece of text that it thinks would best suit the purpose that you're coding for. Now, this tool has been trained on vast amount of open source data that have been hosted on GitHub. And one is it generates copyright concerns. So these were open source software which is licensed on open source licenses, which mean that they could only be used for certain kind of purposes and it should be available to everybody and things like that. But here it's been used for a proprietary feature called a GitHub Copilot. So those concerns are one aspect of this. But then now the code that has been outputted by this GitHub Copilot, the who owns it and how do you attribute it is a matter of debate.
Dispute.
So yeah, so for example, this has been trained on open source software, and there is an AI model that is recommending this to you, and it's also taking inputs from the person who is coding in that instance, right? So in this kind of a scenario, does the original source code should that get the attribution, or should the model get the attribution, or should it be shared between all three parties? These are all things which we have never really faced before, and I think the copyright laws, all of these things should kind of evolve to keep pace with these kind of developments.
Sure, I think so. I think like that's a very interesting thing. Satya, you wanted to add something to this one?
Yeah, on the open-ended question that Bharat left us with, I think it's probably going to be very difficult once copyleft licensed code is if ever accidentally used in training something like GitHub Copilot. I mean, I wonder what that's going to end up like, because copyleft has resulted in Oracle losing a lot of royalties because they've used copyleft software to, I think, create code for their routers or something, software routers. So I wonder what that's going to look like, because that is a huge legal minefield.
I think this legality around this is going to be very interesting, and I'm glad that I've got a bunch of all you guys you're actually trained in the law on this conversation. But after we understand now, while we have debates around like who owns this data, then we're talking about who should be attributed for the AI models that are developed and so on. Now there's this whole, imagine this opportunity that exists. And when an opportunity exists, technology and business and commerce is going to definitely come in there, right? So there is incredibly rich data that's available today about my purchase history and the purchase history of the millions of people who've been on Amazon, or my credit card information, my information about like my interactions on Twitter or my interactions on Facebook and everything. And when you put all that information together, it can teach you a lot about human behavior. It can tell you what somebody might do next. You could use it for a host of applications, right? There's like millions of things that can be done. Businesses would be very keen on understanding like the kind of products I buy in order to figure out what to advertise to me at a very basic level. But there are many, many other things. They could even figure out who's the potential market for a new service based on my behavior as like a first mover or otherwise and everything else. Now, and you can't have this situation where only some few people have access to it. What are the solutions available? Do you guys have any ideas on the solutions available to deal with this? So all this data that's available with Zoom, with GitHub, the data available at with Facebook and Google and everybody else. Now, how do other people who are trying to develop models access this information?
Maybe I'll just jump in with some kind of a context about how the data is used for training the LLMs in the first place, and before we get into what we can see as ways of making that data accessible on fair and equal terms, or any other solutions that we might think of, right? So, for example, now when we look at LLMs, they are trained on a large amount of data, and that's usually the base model or the foundational model, the pre-training of that model. And this could be, like we discussed earlier, it could be trillions of tokens gathered by scraping Wikipedia, news websites, or scientific publications, books, and whatnot, right? So all of these usually publicly available sources are scraped through, and you have all of these models which are trained on this vast amount of data.
And they also they claim that they've also used licensed model data. They've also got some licensed data and accessed it.
Yeah, even maybe data from certain social media sites also could have been a part of this training process. Now, after this step, so you have a base model which is capable of interpreting text or making sense of that. So after this step is when they are fine-tuned for a particular use case. It might be, say, for use as a chat bot. So you have ChatGPT, for example, where you ask a question and it's able to make sense of that thing and generate a probabilistic answer which might fit into that kind of a context. Or you might have something like an image generator which will interpret the text that you have entered and generate an image which matches that prompt. So these are all based on fine-tuning of that model, the base model, for a particular task. So this, you'll have a certain kind of a prompt and what is the response suited for that prompt. And these kind of prompt response training is done as the next step, followed by reinforcement learning through human feedback, where you get humans to give feedback to the output that the models are generating. So this is like a multi-step process, and finally, when you have these models which are deployed, they are learning even while you're using them. So you might be asking some question, and then you'll ask a follow-up question, and it uses the previous response and the subsequent prompts that you're giving it to finally give you the response that you're looking for.
Yeah. So you could also have companies. You could also have companies, Bharath, which, let's say, I'm a large bank which has I put all my rules in, my data in, my the proprietary data also on top of this large language model, and then now it can use this data to now tell people what's their bank balance, or it should be or be able to tell them these are the rules, this is how you can get a loan, these are the next steps or whatever, and so on, right? So they can use it.
You can maybe feed in your, say, some resumes of applicants, and then it could screen these applicants for a certain open position that might be there. So all of these data, again, the company is opening up their data, and the model uses that to generate some kind of a thing. So now I'll leave it to Satya to take on the question that you posed initially, on how we can address some of these issues which come up. It's a big question. So.
I'll start off with a small plug for our GCVP course. Like, these concepts that I'm going to talk about are elaborated a lot more in a lot of depth by the instructors in our courses. So when we look at data, we're trying to understand the competition issues or the social welfare issues that crop up because of a bottlenecking of access to data, right? We should understand the nature of data. Now, the economic characteristics of data are non-rivalrous, that they pose in economies of scale and scope. That means that data aggregation in huge data sets is naturally inevitable, right? Which is why platforms which are primarily data-driven in their operations, like Google, Facebook, all of them, they end up with big data sets as a matter of course, like the kind of characteristics that data possesses that leads to this. Now, non-rivalrous nature implies that at the end of the day, these companies will try to impose the need for exclusive rights in order to incentivize data production. They are investing things that's costly for them, so they're going to incentivize data production when it's costly for them to create this and also to monetize it further. Now, when government or regulatory intervention is needed, we need to balance access and exclusion, so to speak. So when Bharat talked about openness, we need to think about that as well. But the challenge is that if you want to create openness and interoperability or data sharing, you want to pose challenges and risks to protecting privacy, security, intellectual property, and trade secrets, right? So as a second order effect, the fairness, quality, and reliability of data, for instance, because once you make it open source, like or source it openly, those are things that operational things that we have to tackle as well. So
Yeah.
Coming back to the point about what a society can choose to do if they believe that social benefits of governmental intervention outweighs private costs, because if you move towards openness or conversely reduced access to this data in the first place, then private costs for both firms and individuals are going to occur. Like individuals will not have, let's say, access to a feature on an app that they have grown to like. For instance, I think Swiggy is trying to implement what do you want to eat, and I assume it's using something like previous tastes or orders, etc. They'll probably not have access to something like that, right? So there is no clear way forward to creating this, because if you move towards openness, you are opening access up further, which means you have privacy issues. But there can be some possible measures like governments need to start listening to technical experts a lot more, because they need to start collaborating. Because once you have common definitions for data sharing and interoperability, even cross-border stuff, then you have, when you have protocols for data exchange and use, when you have some sort of collective management and governance of data, that, I mean, it's a pipe dream most likely in this current geopolitical scenario. But having that maybe a global cooperative would probably help that way. Alternatively, the government can also come in and say, hey, we'll provide financial incentive or whatever tax cuts, etc., if you share data or you ensure that interoperability exists with data sets. Then, I mean, also implementing legal frameworks or contracts that define the rights and obligations of data subjects, data sharers, users, brokers, all of them. That is easier said than done, because again, like I mentioned, these definitions are not uniform across jurisdictions, right? Finally, I mean, you can probably also develop technical tools or platforms like GitHub Copilot, for instance, as long as they're explicit in their terms and conditions that they are going to enable secure and user-friendly data sharing and interoperability, probably be a way in which monopolies or oligopolies around data sets for AI training can be prevented. But like I said, the nature of data is that it is going to agglomerate in huge data sets. So before governmental intervention, I think we'll have to allow for decentralized, community-based or society-based measures to come into force. Because if the government does intervene, it's difficult to fill in the gap that this kind of scenario already fulfills.
So there are two types of solutions that the industry has sort of toyed with in the past, right? So they looked at things like data commons, where the data is now owned by everybody and everybody sort of accesses it. You can access anybody's data, but like basically you put it all into a pool. The idea being that it's going to be useful. It's now easily accessible. The other areas where it's a data cooperative, where ownership is a little more defined, and the use is also a little more sort of structured. So you have your data commons, data cooperatives. Then I think it's also about coming up. I think if you start off with a basic premise of who owns the data, and then you find a way by which the data is sort of aggregated into little packets, like data packets, then you put a value into data packets because they create a market for data packets, which are exclusive, the ones which are not exclusive. Then you have data going into a different place where people own aggregated data, and how do you sort of work on that? I think it's an incredible complex question and a big problem to be sort of solved. But I think it was important for us to put it out there and highlight that it's something that's important to be dealt with. And if you don't deal with this aspect of how to access all the data that's been created, you don't want it to be, then we'll be handing over power, unbridled power, into the hands of very few. And that may not be in society's interest, right? You want to make sure that there's enough competition and there's enough opportunity for everybody to come in and benefit from AI and protect us from the harms of AI, right? So
I believe the definitional problem also exists in whether, how do I say it, specified ownership and access rights, or conversely unspecified or improperly or ineffectively specified ownership and access rights. Which one of these maximizes the welfare of society? And is facilitation of development of AI and machine learning also doing that. So, and that is we can't really preempt the answer to that as at this point. So this is a value judgment to be made by societies in different jurisdictions. So once that becomes a little more concrete, I believe we'll have more answers to these preceding questions. But yeah.
So Bharat, do you have any final thoughts on this topic?
So, on one additional aspect of this is, I think the competition, the copyright legislation, and how those aspects kind of determine how data can be used. I think when you have data that's being scraped at such scale, there's the copyright laws kind of limit how that data can be used, right? So the goal is that fair use is allowed when there's in certain cases when the user of the original copyrighted data is not, their ability to use that profitably is not hindered, for example. And so there are a bunch of conditions which need to be met. So like you can use it for businesses. I mean, what is the purpose why you're using it? Is it for businesses or for a non-profit kind of a purpose? And have you really done any kind of a transformative change on that data itself? Are you merely doing something factual, or are you generating something creative in that process? So all of these kind of considerations kind of allow copyrighted data to be used for training these models. So that the laws associated with fair use and how the data can be used, I think those also will be something that need to be relooked at, considering the scale at which data is going to be used. And a lot of that data will be copyrighted, and the limiting it into a certain, I mean, not saying that it's not allowed to use copyrighted data might not be in the best interest, because the potential, that the value that is generated by having these AI models which are more capable might actually be to the wider benefit of society, right? So,
we need to find. I think we need to find innovative ways by which I think all you lawyers have to sort of get together and find some great solutions. So I'm just thinking, a lot of it seems to be around the law, around the law in terms of like what is the copyright law, who owns ownership law, data transfer, jurisdiction, this country, that country, where. I mean, I think there's a lot. So I think there's a lot of potential for lawyers in this space, it looks like.
Potential is I mean, yes, yeah, it's in many different ways.
Anyway.
But I think so. So again, which is why I really don't want it to be a monopolistic or oligopolistic scenario to happen. But knowing, again, like going back to the characteristics of data here, a first mover will have a significant advantage over its competitors simply because its models, by virtue of having interacted with a greater number of users over a large period, are able to in case of generative AI, for instance, are able to generate more engaging and more useful content than their rivals, right? This is a positive feedback loop, because this is going to improve the performance of their model. Then that product can get better the more people use them for a longer period of time. But the flip side, so it's good. So in a way, it's good for social benefit, right? Because people are able to do that. I think a lot of, I mean, yeah, let's skirt the issues around copyright of art and music and all of that. But a lot of people who are unable to, let's say, write things well or something, or again, skirting the issues around plagiarism aside, it enables a lot of people to do things that they weren't able to do before, right? But at the same time, this will result in a concentrated market with less possibility for entrants to compete effectively. So there's definitely legal and policy interventions to be had, because network effects are, I mean, even if it's benign, still do pose a huge threat for potential abuse of dominance later down the line, which is why antitrust law, the Federal Trade Commission in the US has preemptively started looking into this kind of network effects from I think 2018 onwards, could be wrong. I mean, even if these companies are not engaging in unfair methods of competition, these network effects can create perverse incentives down the line for them to do so, or simply by a matter of fact.
Just because somebody's not doing it today or they don't have intention to do harm doesn't mean. I think the potential to do harm has to be understood and prevented and protected against right up front.
Yeah. What action that might entail, how can be manifested, I'm not sure. I don't think anyone has a concrete idea about it. So, because it's, again, at the end of the day, value judgment that a particular society will have to make. So EU is going to have a different perspective, USA different perspective, India may or may not follow in their line, I don't know.
Yeah. So I think this is a very interesting topic, and I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the days and weeks and months to come. And as we sort of work more towards understanding the need for AI governance, the areas which need to be governed, the things that need to be done in order to ensure that innovation thrives and like harm is minimized, right? I think that's largely the goal when we look at it from that perspective. So thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I'm hoping that, we'll have more such in the coming days. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sridhar.
Thank you, Sridhar.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.